Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Dr. Rob Farley of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. Today, we have with us Erica Chenoweth from the University of Denver. Do you want to introduce yourself, Erica?
Sure. I'm Erica Chenoweth. I'm an associate professor at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, and I'm also an associate senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo.
And the Peace Research, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. Okay, all right. Which is different than, I mean, CIPRI is Swedish, right? Is that
right? Yeah, right. It's PRIO. It's the group in Oslo that does a lot of Civil War data set collection and that sort of thing.
Right. The CIPRI is very, I always love because it has so much arms trade. There's so much about the arms trade, and so that's always very interesting to me. So what we're talking about today is actually sort of this conjunction of, basically actually what we just talked about, right? So stuff that I'm really interested in, which is violent conflict. You write for a blog called Political Violence at a Glance, but your most recent work really is about political nonviolence. Well, I guess I'll let you. Why don't you summarize the argument of the article in the book with respect to nonviolent protest and the effectiveness of nonviolent protest?
Yeah. So let me first just talk about what I mean when I talk about nonviolent resistance and civil resistance. So there's actually a few different categories of action. You can think about principled nonviolence. And so usually when you say the word nonviolence, especially in the activist community, people associate that with this principled position that it's ethically wrong to use violence. And there's also a pragmatic dimension to principled nonviolence, which is also, many of these people would also argue that violence doesn't work as well as nonviolence either. But my approach is more actually just looking at the observed behaviors of the actors. So looking at nonviolent resistance as a category of political action as opposed to a moral stance. So when I talk about civil resistance or nonviolent resistance, what I'm talking about is just when unarmed civilians are initiating the conflict from the bottom up, and they're doing so in a way where they're relying solely on actions and tactics that do not physically harm or threaten to physically harm the opponent directly. And so they're using things
So pause you for a second. Does that include, so how do we think about property damage in this context, right? So not physically harming people, but property damage in its many ways. We could conceive like a factory seizure or breaking, all the way up to breaking a Starbucks.
Yeah.
How is that defined?
For me, in the research that I do, I count this as violence. And part of the reason for that is actually just a methodological reason, which is that we're trying to use the most unassailable definitions of these categories as we can, right? So let's say that I counted a bunch of nonviolent campaigns and like 50% of them had property damage in them and 50% of them didn't. Then when I'm making the claim that nonviolent resistance is successful, a lot of people might ask, well, is it because of that kind of gray area of violent action that kind of blatantly threatens people more? And I wouldn't have a good answer to that question, right? So we actually count things like kind of getting into riots and property damage and that sort of thing as radical flank or moving into violence. And it's, like I said, mostly for methodological reasons. From a strategic perspective, I think these things are highly contingent on whatever the context is on the ground. And in fact, I think that, for activists, the most important question isn't, whether property damage counts as violence or not. It's more about whether property damage increases people's participation or decreases it, right? So if people, smash a Starbucks and all of a sudden the size of the campaign triples, then that indicates that was a popular kind of action. If they smash a Starbucks and nobody shows up at the next event, which actually in this country, in the United States, is more likely to happen, then usually that's a good indicator that it's not benefiting the campaign.
Now, if I could interrupt you for a second. So what you just said, sort of in this country, in the United States, breaking a Starbucks does not generate additional participation. Is that something that tends to vary quite a bit, right? Or are there different contexts in which the use of sort of strategic, and not calling it nonviolence, but maybe just property damage or something like that, does in fact generate additional participation? Have you found something along those lines, or?
Nothing is immediately springing to mind with regard to the property damage. That doesn't mean that there aren't cases. It just means that I'm not thinking of any right now. As far as I can tell, nobody has really systematically studied that. So we don't really know the answer systematically to that question. I can say that there are some cases, like if you think about Egypt 2011, people were burning down they let some buildings on fire that were associated with state institutions and media and stuff. And I don't think that actually had any net effect on the participation rates. Like, I think that was viewed as acceptable by the majority of people that were out there engaged in the Tahrir Square demonstrations, at least. So, it wasn't offensive, but to them. But at that point, they were already huge. So their concerns about growing participation were not as severe as they would be, for instance, when you're trying to build a movement.
Okay. So the argument, or what your findings seem to suggest, are that sort of this continuous debate that goes on, not just in the activist community, but in pretty much any social organization whatsoever, from the activist community to the Catholic Church, is this question of broad participation versus intense participation. With respect to the effectiveness of the movement, this question in your research is generally resolved in the direction of broad participation over intense participation.
Right.
So just having a lot of people out there, maybe who don't feel super strongly or who aren't willing to make extraordinary sacrifices with respect to the cause, but are willing to make some sacrifice and are willing to demonstrate that they make some sacrifice, that this is sort of a key determinant of effectiveness.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, as far as we can tell, when we look in our data, at least, it's really important to point out that our data that we collected, which covered 323 campaigns of violent and nonviolent action from 1900 to 2006, that these campaigns are actually what you might call maximalist campaigns, which are basically removal of an incumbent government and territorial independence, either from a colonial power or from, to secede. And so we're not looking at, reformist goals in that data set. But for those types of campaigns, these maximalist campaigns, what we find is that for the campaigns for which we have data, none of them that had actually gone above 3.5% of the population had failed.
Okay.
And nonviolent campaigns, if you look at them as a percentage of the population, are on average 11 times larger than the average violent campaign, meaning that they just solicit so many more participants. And there's something, Mark Lickbach had written about this in 95 in his book, The Rebel's Dilemma, where he talked about the 5% rule, basically saying that 5% of the population is basically all a campaign needs to succeed. And my sense is that that's counted in terms of active participants, the way we code it as well. But if you actually get like 5% of the population to support a campaign, chances are there's like a really strong majority of the population that's supportive, right? So that people that are sort of like rooting for the campaign, but not really willing to go out and take the high risk action. And so I think that actually what the larger campaigns represent is more broad-based social support, essentially, for the campaign's goals. So you do get the sense that there's a shift in the sort of legitimacy battle on the ground. And for me, like whether that takes 3 days or 3 weeks to happen, or whether it takes, 3 years to happen, that's sort of the critical lever and the determinant of the outcome of the conflict, is who has the legitimacy.
So how high, in the data, how high are the biggest campaign? It's sort of I guess there are two things that I'm thinking about. One about is that I remember this, and I can't even remember the name of the book off the hand, but it talked about the legitimacy and the survival of the South Vietnamese state post-1972, and it made this claim that we have evidence that, as much as 2/3 of the population of South Vietnam was, completely willing to tolerate the existence of South Vietnam. Which, in the terms you just stated, sort of suggests, well, really, 34% of the people, potentially, wouldn't even tolerate the existence of the country. And so, in the context, it's completely understandable why it disappeared.
Exactly.
But in cases like, East Germany, where the entire population of Leipzig basically was showing up on the street. I mean, what are the biggest numbers that we have, or the biggest percentages that are in your data set in terms of like how big anti-state social movements are?
Yeah. So I think the largest in the data set was actually, interestingly, the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, where it was reported that about 1 in 4 Lebanese were in the streets demanding that Syrian troops and Syrian kind of officials withdraw. And they actually did succeed there in the short term in creating that outcome. So that's like 25% of the population. That's about, I mean, as big as it's going to get with people that are willing to take high risk action. With regard to Leipzig, for example, my guess is that the East German uprising of 53 might be one of the largest campaigns that failed, right? And part of the reason for this is because it was, in some sense, kind of like an Soviet domination / occupation campaign.
Right.
And territorial campaigns, those that are kind of both kind of political, like against the incumbent government, but also have a territorial dimension, they're much harder to win than anti-government campaigns. So people that are, trying to expel a colonial power or who are essentially trying to secede, in this case, of course, reunification, but it was a territorial dimension, that's actually very difficult to win, even when the whole population is sort of willing to engage.
Right. I mean, it would seem to me that, East Germany 53 is this, the odds are stacked against it in so many ways, especially because, from the Soviet point of view, and I think even by 53, or even in 53 from the Western point of view, it's, the occupation is still being understood as punishment, right, as much as about sort of realizing the hopes and dreams of the German people, right? Well, no, they have horrible hopes and dreams, and those shouldn't be realized. And so, but that's really interesting, right? And then, I mean, I guess part of the story would be as the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe is slowly but steadily reframed over the course of the next 30 years as sort of defense of the socialist bloc, et cetera, you get a lower threshold for what you need to succeed in these sorts of protests.
Well, and, part of the reason for that is actually because the main mechanism through which civil resistance works, through which these numbers create the change, is because they actually start to create defections within the opponent, right? So it's very difficult to imagine in 1953, given the context and given sort of the nature of the occupation force at that time, that you were going to start seeing defections. Now, over the longer term, you do start seeing them because, people are deployed or they live there for a long time. They make friends. They establish relationships that they wish to maintain in the longer term. And it becomes clear when these types of uprisings start that, if they side with the side they've been with all along, that it's not going to pay off in the long run for them. And so they're kind of not all equally loyal, and they're willing to reconsider under a lot of circumstances. And so, even in Israel, for example, during the first Intifada, there were a decent number of Israeli Defense Force troops that became unwilling to serve in the occupied territories. They were called the refuseniks. And, that was actually a function of the large broad-based participation on the Palestinian side, essentially creating this dilemma, which was, are you really going to come over here and kill unarmed people to defend, something that maybe doesn't need to be defended? And so they actually did create this dilemma, and you got this refusenik movement. So it can happen even in these territorial conflicts, but it's much less likely because of typically like ethnic divisions and things like that make it less likely for defections to happen.
Right, which I think partially goes to the explain. Well, and we'll talk about Syria a little bit later, but is at least one of the plausible explanations behind the failure of both violent and nonviolent resistance in Syria. So, if the pragmatic choice here, which the research suggests, if the pragmatic choice sort of indicates nonviolence over violence, right? Sort of setting aside any principled commitment to pacifism or lack thereof. Why do we still, why is there still this? Why do we still have an argument between violent and nonviolent resistance? Why do people still choose, and especially in the Palestinian context, right, where from the first Intifada we have seen in the wake of that several violent resistance movements. So why do people still choose, sometimes at least, why do they choose violent resistance movements?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is one of my new kind of research projects that I'm working on, and my sense is that there are lots of reasons why people use violence. And a lot of people use it regardless of whether they think it's going to lead to their long-term strategic interests or not. So you do have this occasional group of people, which I would call rational insurgents, who basically have no, they have no prior preference at all about whether to use violence or nonviolent resistance. And truly, for them, it's an informational issue. Like, if they actually knew that nonviolent resistance gave them a better shot, they probably would have no, reservation about trying it out. The problem is that there are very few groups out there that feel free to choose kind of dispassionately between one or the other. And a huge reason for that, I think, is because of organizational dynamics where, frankly, you're just dealing with personalities and people's prior beliefs, and there's sort of baggage around violence and all that kind of stuff. And it kind of creates this internal dynamic. And a lot of times in some of my other research, I've been able to discern that, groups will often escalate to violence, or they escalate the nature or the intensity of the violence that they're using, basically to outbid other rival organizations, or to prove something to their own internal membership, to prove that they're serious, that they're deserving of the title of, dear leader and all that stuff. And so then you also get a category of people for whom violence is almost improvisational. So, the campaigns aren't the only actors in these conflicts. And you'll often get this interfacing or this interaction between, the opponent and the campaign, where the opponent is deliberately trying to provoke a violent reaction. And, it's in a lot of contexts not very difficult to do. This is one of the main reasons, I think, that states use state terror. State terror basically serves two functions. The first is that it scares to death all of the people that aren't already mobilized, or some of those that have been kind of low committed in terms of their participation. And the other thing it does is it completely radicalizes all the people that are actually highly committed to the cause. And so what you get is this kind of polarization between people who just want to stay out of the way, and the only people kind of left standing are the ones that are, really basically wounded, or have witnessed something that's driving them into more extreme measures. And then you have people that are just hyper ideological, and that the use of violence is totally integral to the particular ideology that they're seeking.
Is it evidence? Well, is it totally integral, or is it evidence of their commitment to? Is it evidence just of sort of they're willing to take risks in service of the objective that they may be pursuing?
Yeah, I think it's
which is part of the outbidding process.
Commitment.
Which I think, yeah,
exactly, it's a demonstration of commitment. But I think there are actually some ideologies out there that it's difficult to imagine that people winning without actually using violence. If your ideology calls you to exterminate another race or another religious group or something like that, then it's kind of hard to imagine how one would go about that nonviolently.
Right.
My point here is that I think that in our field, what we like to do is try to come up with these sort of singular explanations for why people use violence. And my kind of recent research and experience suggests that there's lots of reasons, and that there isn't some kind of one size fits all group of policies or ways that I could try to persuade people like, well, just use nonviolent resistance. It's more effective. And that people would be like, oh, great. I'm really glad you shared that information with me. Well, we'll get to that tomorrow,
Right, exactly.
There's all kinds of like resistance to this notion. So,
right. I mean, have you gotten some of that response from like activist organizations that's like, well, I don't know, in the American context, I guess most activist organizations tend not to be that far from at least an appreciation of nonviolence, right? There are some that are, but they may be totally non-receptive in the first place to even thinking about nonviolence as a pragmatic matter. So,
yeah, I mean, I think all around the world, I hear pretty much really similar reactions to this. Mm-hmm. The first is, we know it works, but that's not our problem. Mm-hmm. Like, our problem is more that, we have a good, healthy bunch of people in our group that don't believe that. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to believe that no matter what evidence you present. Mm-hmm. The second reaction that's very common is, nobody has ever had it as bad as us.
Right.
And the third reaction that we get is, that like my situation is different for X, Y, Z reasons. The opponent is different. The sort of dynamics are different. Like, but actually there's a point behind that, which is that our data are kind of limited to a very specific set of cases, mm-hmm. That it's not, it's randomly distributed across those cases, but we do have a small subset of like the whole universe of activism, right? Mm-hmm. But my sense is that there's really no reason why the kind of explanation that participation leads to defections, leads to change, wouldn't apply in a variety of different contexts. Mm-hmm. And whether you're talking about a democracy or non-democracy or territorial conflict, it seems like participation is kind of like a necessary but insufficient condition, right? So, my reaction to all that is just like, well, we need to study that. Like, there isn't like a clear, we all have to get like more engaged in the empirical analysis of these things to know the answers to those questions. But
such a political science answer. That answer is so political science.
I know.
So stubbornly political science.
Yeah, but I mean, this is one of my like main irritants in life, is when people make baseless empirical claims, and so, daily frustrations right. in life. But I think that the answer to most of those is like, we don't know yet. And of course, like, everybody's situation is different, but there certainly are extremely similar processes that we see leading to success in case after case after case. And so, usually the way I respond to people is by looking for similarities rather than differences.
So, empirically, how do we go? And you've done some interviews and you've done some discussions with respect to Egypt, but at least the stuff I found online, is sort of snapshotty along the way of Egypt's path to wherever Egypt happens to be right now. I mean, are the two consecutive coups in Egypt, are both of these non-violent, right? Sort of where there's a non-violent, are these coded as non-violent resistance leading to a transformation in the state, which seems to be followed by violence? Or, I guess that's that, or that question is enough probably. But. Yeah.
So 2011, we would code as a nonviolent campaign followed by success in the removal of the incumbent government. And then, in terms of our coding decisions, we do it just in terms of like what the activists were demanding vis-a-vis the existing leader. And if they were asking for him to leave, then we would code it as a success if he left. Mm-hmm. Now, the longer term, kind of the fallout of the campaign would actually show up in our research on the after effects of these campaigns. And essentially what we would be demonstrating there is that, it didn't follow the typical path that we see where, the campaigns are like, far more likely, something like 10 times more likely than violent campaigns to become democratic. Mm-hmm. And they're much less likely to relapse into civil conflict than your typical armed conflict. So, in a sense, it's not following that normal pattern. On the other hand, if you can imagine 2011 being an armed uprising,
right.
we might actually be in a better situation today with the way it went down than if it had been a massive armed insurgency where we could have seen a whole different story play out, right?
Right. I mean,
So,
nobody thinks that an Egyptian civil war starting in 2011 would have been a good idea. I mean, I should say there probably are some people who think that it would have been better, and sort of, but very few people think this. So.
Right. And so that's one way to kind of think about all of our claims is that we're comparing the relative effectiveness and the relative like fallout from these two different types of struggle. And then, in 2013, I code this as a coup. I mean, this was basically a group of nationalists, like liberal/nationalists, that were essentially in collusion with the military, calling for them to step in. And it was staged, in a way that would make it look like another revolution, lead to coup. But actually, I think
the demonstrations were pretty large.
Yeah,
I mean, and the Coptic community seemed pretty unified is too strong a word to use, but I mean, pretty willing to turn out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think that that it ends up being, though, that there was a lot of collusion, I think, beforehand between these different groups and the military. I think they kind of set it up so that it's much more of kind of a popular coup than it is a civil resistance leading to defections, leading to change, which the first one, I think, was. I think 2011 was unexpected by the military completely. I think it did lead to defections. I think they threw Mubarak under the bus and so forth. But the 2013 was not that. It was like, activists kind of overshooting the landing strip as defections go.
But as a general empirical observation, this sort of a nonviolent revolution leads to or reduces the potential for sort of the worst depredations of the post-revolutionary state. With some exception, I think you talked about Iran a little bit in terms of the exceptions, that this is one where you do have some of the nastier post-revolutionary politics, but in most cases you don't have the post-revolutionary blood purge that you have associated with violent revolutions.
Yeah, I think that's right, and in general. And I think that a lot of it probably depends on the way the change goes down. And I actually have a student who's writing this thesis right now on looking at the mechanism through which civil resistance works. So whether it's by, forcing the incumbent to resign, to hold free and fair elections through which they get ousted, whether it's through complete dissolution of the state, whether it's through a coup, and whether it's through like a pacted negotiation. And it turns out that the sort of best case scenarios are through these pacted transitions where, the civil resistance campaign sort of forces the opponent to sit at a table and hash out what the new system's going to look like. And that would be like a solidarity movement in Poland. And it turns out that coups are actually the second worst in terms of the outcomes. And of course, it's not super surprising, but it makes sense to think about if you hand power, if you call for the military to defect and they defect and step in, it kind of creates then a coup dynamic where the military has to sort of voluntarily give up authority after it's taken huge risks to get into a place of authority, right? So if there's no way to sort of hold them to account or create some kind of checks and balances, then the chances of this winding up being one of those successful cases of nonviolent resistance goes down.
So if I'm sitting in DoD or Department of State, or well, really either DoD or Department of State, and I'm reading this and I'm thinking about how do I think about this research in context of maximizing U.S. global interests, right? And maybe I'm thinking about this in two ways. I'm thinking about it in one way that by and large, horrible revolutionary violence tends to be bad for the United States just because of how the United States is positioned in the world. And the second part is maybe I'm thinking about, but we kind of want revolutions in places like Syria, maybe less Burma now because it's our friend, but other places like Iran and so forth. We have this machinery of policy to create military interventions, right? We know how to do military interventions. It's not hard. You start with cruise missiles and then you go on. But what kind of policy machinery can a state like the United States, how do we go about turning violent resistance movements into nonviolent resistance movements, ensuring that resistance movements, or not ensuring, but at least sort of pushing resistance movements towards nonviolence? What sort of policy machinery can there be that pushes in these directions that we like?
Yeah, so I actually think it's really kind of impossible to do. I don't think nonviolent campaigns can be exported, nor should they be. They can't be imported either. So there was a lot of buzz around how color revolutions and even some of the Arab Spring cases were somehow manufactured, by the West or something. And again, empirically baseless claims, But I think that we do some things that can really hurt these campaigns. And one of the things that we tend to do is, first of all, we tend to disincentivize nonviolent resistance and incentivize violent resistance by arming rebels. Like we sort of in Libya, for example, it's oh, finally, there's something we're familiar with. There's an armed group, of former defectors. Let's go intervene using a military intervention on behalf of them and give them all kinds of weapons and stuff. And as soon as the Free Syrian Army, holed up in Turkey, it was oh, great. Now we actually have somebody, that this is a familiar toolkit, right? Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that this actually really, what it does is it subverts any type of kind of nonviolent campaign that's underway, as happened in Syria. I mean, the nonviolent campaign is underway, and then all of a sudden, all these armed actors start showing up, and all these international actors start boosting them, with weapons and stuff like that, and intelligence, and you name it. And so it ends up that the people on the ground who've been using nonviolent action are not only is their campaign kind of cut short before it can run its course, but the second thing is that those people are at so much risk now. Because if you're familiar with Ben Valentino's work on civilian victimization, he's got this book called Final Solutions, and it's about mass atrocities in the 20th century. And basically what he finds is that the most common type of mass killing is not your Holocaust or your Pol Pot purges. It's actually more counter-guerrilla, counterinsurgency campaigns. And it's drain the swamp counterinsurgency, so sort of scorched earth counterinsurgency like in Guatemala or in Syria today. And the deal is that that kind of mass killing happens most often when the civilian population that's unarmed has been demonstrating and kind of showing that they're in opposition to the government. And then as soon as the armed actors build up, then all those people that have been out there showing their faces, in the streets are just wiped out because the government assumes that they're supporting the rebels overtly, right? Even if they aren't, even if they're decrying the fact that the rebels have come onto the scene. So in that sense, that there's a lot of kind of moral hazard effects that come out of this. And that we have to totally rethink, how gleeful we are when a rebel group emerges, even if it's against somebody that we think is operating against our interests. Right.
I mean, sort of when you said that this can't be exported, imported, I guess one of the first things that occurred to my mind is how often state actors will make claims about even nonviolent protesters, that are based around, this is, both in the, it's in Putin makes this argument, but also you saw this argument pretty commonly in the United States in, 1920 and in 1950. These are all foreign agitators, right? Even if it's a nonviolent movement, these are foreign agitators. And so there seems to be this, teeming belief that these movements are often actually exported or imported. So it's interesting. But, that's also kind of depressing, right? That there's no, I mean, can't there be something like a program of, that instead of training camps for guerrillas in Turkey, we create an infrastructure that can support nonviolent. But I guess as long as you have the outbidding process, that's still part of a problem.
Well, so here's what I think. I think that embassies probably are never going to be well suited to be in the business of outright supporting nonviolent campaigns, right? I do think that there are things that we can do, that the international community can do, or that other states can do that actually, at the right moment, could have a big effect on the campaign. One of them is like removing support for an ally. So in the Philippines, for example, I think the U.S.'s removal of support for Marcos in 1986, like basically Reagan calling him and saying you're on your own, was really huge, actually, in creating more defections. Right. So if you can get those defections, it's really important. And states can sometimes facilitate that either by removing support or by, providing these like golden parachute opportunities where they're, basically saying you have free passage and we're going to make sure you and your family get out safely. Right. And now's the time.
That makes sense in the context of the collapse of Eastern Europe, right? I mean, when the Soviet Union indicating it was not going to go to the wall to save all of these regimes in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing is just, figuring out ways to mitigate the effects of repression. So, whether that's figuring out a way to deprive regimes of the means of doing these types of mass killings, anything that can be done to slow down the delivery of these weapons or block their entry into the country. George Lopez has done a lot of work on this, like trying to figure out how you actually get the material slowed down so that they can't unleash it. And it sort of buys the movement some time, maybe. I mean, in Syria, I think they, in a way, the repression was bad, but if they had more time to sort of coalesce into some kind of organized opposition and come up with a strategy that would allow them to be resilient in the face of that repression, we might have seen a totally different story. So I think and actually you mentioned the thing about Syria being one of those cases where defections are unlikely because of ethnic divides. I actually think that there were massive numbers of defection really early on in the campaign. And in fact, the nonviolent phase of the campaign produced all these defections among Sunni military elites and foot soldiers. So much so that Assad had to keep the army in the barracks and use the Air Force instead. Right? Because he realized he couldn't trust the Sunni military troops. And so I think actually the turn to violence is actually in a large way what stopped those defections from happening on such a kind of frequent level. But the other thing the international community can do, I think, is to, really, I think we all do a lot to sort of perpetuate this myth that violence is like the only way out of really tough situations. And it's like, basically, like I mentioned, arming rebels, but then also turning to this question of military intervention right off the bat. And I actually do think that this created wedges within the Syrian opposition because you had, some groups arguing we should be using violence and we should be trying to get the international community to intervene now, right? And then you have a whole bunch of other people that are like, we definitely don't want the international community to intervene. And we, even people that wanted to use violence did not want the international community to intervene. And I think it was one of the key dividing questions in the opposition. And you had like all these exiles wandering around to different Western parliaments and getting in front of people that mattered and kind of making this argument, you have to come in now. And it really did give the Free Syrian Army, I think, a false hope. Because they're hearing from these exiles that they're going to come in any day and you can take these high risk actions now because he's going to fall in 2 weeks. Right.
Increases the risk acceptance and that makes sense.
So there's so many things that the international community did that helped Syria get to the terrible place that it is now. And I wish that, I wish we could rewind history and play that whole thing differently.
Well, of course you do. You're a political scientist, right? I mean, that would be
Right.
that would be perfect if you could do that, right? We all want to rerun World War II 100 times and see what happens. So, but point taken. So, I guess just briefly. So, is there any hope for? Are there any cases in which we can identify that there were these like significant mid-course corrections where a revolutionary movement went violent, but then turned back towards nonviolence, or is it once you've gone violent, you stay violent?
The answer to that is no. In fact, we do have cases where there have been armed groups that essentially stopped using it and started using, not just stopped using it and demobilized or became a political party or something, but stopped using it and started using civil resistance actively. Examples of this might be like in South Africa and the sort of the late stage of the Second Defiance campaign.
Right.
You also have East Timor, where Felon Teal was fighting in the 70s and they got nowhere with regard to Indonesian annexation, and then there was a sustained nonviolent campaign that ended up actually succeeding. Then you have cases like even the first Palestinian Intifada, was a move away from this PLO kind of elite-led armed struggle and into popular civil resistance. You also have Nepal, which is a very interesting case of the Nepalese communist insurgency. Interestingly, like recognizing that civilians were starting to rise up and deciding to hold off and kind of join in, form an alliance with this grassroots movement that essentially ended the war and, of course, placed them in a privileged position. They were definitely the beneficiaries of it, but it was, again, a case where they realized that sustaining the armed struggle was actually going to undermine the civil resistance movement, and so they wanted to be a part of it. So I do think we have examples from history, and there's a woman who wrote an article about it in the May 2013 issue of the Journal of Peace Research. Her name is Veronique Dudoué, and she lays out some of the cases of this. Super interesting.
I mean, it also seems like, just for sort of my surface knowledge, there are examples there both of sort of nonviolent resistance emerging after a significant military defeat, but also of nonviolent resistance emerging in the context of sort of growing military advantage, right? And that might be the case of the Maoists in Nepal, right, where they are, at least to my knowledge, not dealt some sort of really significant defeat before they sort of acquire real sort of genuine civilian power.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's much more often that we see people trying civil resistance, then saying it doesn't work and using armed struggle. The thing that's really interesting about that is that I've started to look at when in a campaign's kind of life cycle do they stop using civil resistance and start using armed struggle. And it turns out that in this entire universe of cases of insurgencies, there's something like 280 insurgencies, violent insurgencies, that I think 2% of them actually tried civil resistance for longer than a year before they turned to armed struggle. And what we know from our data on civil resistance campaigns is the average duration of them is about 2.5 years. And so, none of them actually tried it basically almost none of them tried it long enough to see whether it would actually succeed or not. And most of them tried peaceful methods. And what that means is that they did like 2 or 3 street demonstrations and they got beat up real bad by the government and they said it doesn't work, right? And one of the things that's really important about civil resistance is that a pattern among the successful campaigns is that they actually do a lot more than just street demonstrations. They organize strikes, they organize boycotts, they do mass non-cooperation. Those are the things that actually end up being more effective than demonstrations. And so it's really sad to me, actually, when I look back at these cases and I see that they did like a couple protests and then they said nonviolence doesn't work, we have to use violence. And so actually, if there's just one thing that I could do in the world, if I had a superpower, it would be to like let all people know that there's more to it than street demonstrations.
Right.
And it takes a while, right? And then if those are the 2 things,
but to return to a previous question, that actually seems like something that you could, have training camps for, theoretically, right? I mean, at least if you had some sort of mindset shift, right, that you could have, or maybe sort of DoD-led training camps is the wrong frame for this, but NGOs that sort of spread sort of means and methods of training and resistance to sort of think through these. I mean, that's something that does seem susceptible to information diffusing technologies or information diffusing practices. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think NGOs and especially more civilian-led instruments are much more effective at this kind of knowledge dissemination. At this point in history, I mean, you are going to see every state that faces any type of sustained challenge by nonviolent campaign saying that this is a foreign conspiracy. Right. I mean, they even said it in Turkey, and in Brazil, you're going to see it very commonly. And so you don't want to give, those regimes more fodder. And actually, I think it actually puts people at risk, to overtly support them. And so instead, it's the type of thing where if we can make this information just more horizontally accessible, either through giving it to other activists who talk to other activists who talk to other activists. If that's the way they want to do it, that's great. But the key thing is just to have to, it's very difficult to frame any of this in terms of U.S. interests, right? Because most of the nonviolent campaigns in the 20th century were against governments that the U.S. supported. Sure. They were actually quite anti-American. And I'd say that the vast majority of nonviolent campaigns today are also anti-American, including ones that happen in our country. Right. But basically, that's the diffusion of power that's happening in our world. That people care more about local concerns and they care more about equity issues and things like that. And that's the way it's going. So
funny you should mention. So let's draw that back. I mean, so how has this work sort of affected your view of sort of the tactical decisions made by organizations like Occupy Wall Street and its various iterations, but also sort of labor groups and other forms of protest group in the United States? I mean, the lessons seem to be fairly clear here that, nonviolence, and we even talked about this at the beginning, or that violent action, even to the extent of throwing a rock through a Starbucks, is something that does not generate a broader support. So is that sort of the central lesson that the next iteration of OWS should be taking from this, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are maybe three lessons here. The first is about, broadening the base of participation. And that in large sense means talking to people that are uncomfortable to talk to, right? Mm-hmm. So it was interesting. One time I was giving a kind of a book talk in Berkeley, and there were some activists there, and it was right in the height of Occupy, and I was really I was wondering why nobody from Occupy had ever reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to participate. And I hadn't thought much about whether I wanted to participate or not. I was definitely watching with great interest about what was happening. And I thought that there were a lot of really skillful things that happened, especially early on. But I was kind of shocked that nobody had tried to recruit me. And so I asked somebody one day, why do you think that nobody wants to talk to me about it? And they were sort of I hadn't even thought about it. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's sort of there's all these people out there in society that are natural, allies in a way, that were never pulled in. Mm-hmm. And I was God, I'm the exact person that you would I'm a candidate, right, for this campaign, and I'm not being asked by anybody. So that was interesting. And I just think it's more about pulling in people that aren't typically activists or that aren't associated but are sympathetic.
Right. I mean, I can imagine somebody who's going to be watching this and they're going to say, how dare she sort of impose on her that she needed to be asked, right? Why was she sitting there thinking about who's asking me rather than just showing up, right? But, part of the answer to that from this research is that, well, but that's kind of what you have to do, right? You have to ask and sort of try to recruit and broaden your base in ways that go beyond the extraordinarily enthusiastic core that's going to turn out anyway.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I don't mean it in terms of that I'm some kind of special person, but that I had 50% of my friends on Facebook or whatever were active in it. And there was just no like kind of call for people that wouldn't otherwise be activists to come and show up, right? So I just thought that was strange. So yeah, I didn't mean me like individually. I just meant like they're not reaching out. The second thing is, that the sort of tactical sequence. So it was really interesting that the whole thing started with an occupation, which is a form of nonviolent intervention that a lot of researchers associate with the end of a campaign. Like after you've gotten a huge number of people active through other types of tactics like demonstrations and things, and then you occupy, right? And it was like the first thing that happened. And I think that there's like a lack of sustainability to a tactic like an occupation. It's like siege warfare. It hurts the people that are doing it as much as it hurts the opponent. And it turned out to be kind of a very vulnerable method of nonviolent action in that context. And then the third thing is, just this conversation about violent and nonviolent action. I think the whole thing really did devolve and started pushing, people stopped participating because they got so frustrated with the conversation. Regardless of which side they were on, it was just like, God, every time I go to a General Assembly, we're arguing about this. And, then there was like all kinds of mutual suspicion because people were thinking that there were agents provocateurs or government infiltrators, that there's all that going on. And so basically, like, I think that, save for a couple of the different occupies locally, there weren't clear expressions that this is a nonviolent movement. The New York Occupy explicitly had a commitment to nonviolent resistance, and some of its like early documents. Occupy Chicago, as far as I can tell, they had like a very open conversation about it, and I don't know that it was ever resolved. Occupy Oakland completely devolved into it, and as far as I could tell, didn't ever come out of it. And so, like now, I think that they're doing the sort of second generation, or maybe even by now third generation Occupy people are doing some really incredible things that are related to like economic solidarity, and kind of developing parallel economic institutions. So there was a big news story a couple of weeks ago about Occupy activists pooling their funds and buying a bunch of debt. Did you see that? And then forgiving the debt. Like that kind of stuff is both, walking the walk, but it's also kind of incredibly methodologically savvy because that is a participation enhancing technique, no doubt about it. So I think that I've done some workshops with activists around the world that are mostly just academic workshops. We're talking about nonviolent action, but I've gotten to hear back some of the really innovative things going on, and they're smart. Like they're thinking about doing more long-term things, having it be like a protracted campaign. And there were a ton of lessons learned from Occupy, and I think probably the most important legacies of it are twofold. The first is that economic inequality is on the agenda, which people have never been as aware of it as they are today. And the second thing is that a whole bunch of super smart, super talented activists met each other, right? And that's actually crucial. Just having that access to one another, I think, is going to create much more capacity for kind of a movement of movements in the United States to do something really meaningful. So, the key challenge is deciding what it is they want to do. So whether it's going to be racial justice, economic inequality, money out of politics, I think the conversation is still going on. Right.
And the next generation should have a copy of the book in every library, every OWS library, at least potentially. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you. We're 53 minutes. So this has been a great conversation, and let's do this again sometime soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob.